Welcome everyone. I'm Chet Kerr, a member of the board of the Irvington Historical Society, and I want to welcome all of you today to today's presentation, Divided Loyalties, Tenant Farmers of Philipsburg Manor in the Revolutionary War. A couple of preliminary things. We are recording this presentation, and we hope to post it up on our website within the next week or so. And we will have a time at the end for questions and answers. And as we go along, as Char presents, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, or you can wait to the end and put questions in the chat. And once Char is done with her presentation, she will try to see if she can answer those questions as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome as our presenter today, Char Weigel, who is the Vice President for Special Projects for Revolutionary Westchester 250. As many of you know, Revolutionary Westchester 250 was started 5 years ago by Connie Kehoe and is Westchester County's nonprofit entity that's working to organize, support, and amplify the many ways the county is preparing to commemorate our country's 250th anniversary in 2026. Char's past experience includes chair of the history and interdisciplinary departments at the Shipley School, researcher and educator at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and board member of the Historic Society serving Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown. In her current role at Revolutionary Westchester 250, Char presents and publishes articles on Westchester County history and guides walking tours for New York State's Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, and for the Historical Society serving Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown. We're very lucky to have Char with us today, so please join me in welcoming her to our program. So Char, with that, I'm going to turn my camera off and you're on.
Thank you, Chet. And let me just pull up my slides here. Give you all a bit of an apology in that I'm recovering from COVID, so it's a really good thing we planned this for Zoom, right? But hopefully you'll be able to understand my voice here. So it's such a pleasure to be here, and I do want to start with a couple of quick thank yous to people who opened their files to me for this research, including our county archivist, Jackie Graziano, Patrick Rafferty, that many of us know at the Westchester County Historical Society, Mark Cheshire, my colleague at RW 250 and the Croton Village historian, and everyone at the mighty Irvington Historical Society, especially Elizabeth Remsen, who took a lot of time to pull a lot of documents for me, some of which you'll be seeing in the presentation this afternoon. And as Chet mentioned, I do a lot of walking tours, and this presentation spun out of one that I've been doing lately, along with my friend and colleague, Robert Lee, of the Old Croton Aqueduct State Historic Park. And we've been having a lot of fun walking along the aqueduct over the very farms of the tenant farmers that we're talking about and presenting this kind of information. So these tours are free, and we'll be starting them up again in the fall. So keep an eye on our RW 250 website. You should sign up for our monthly newsletter on events, all things related to the Revolutionary War, and you'll find out about them, as well as with the Friends of the Old Croton Aqueduct, a magnificent organization that's really preserving this treasure, and also is helping us get the word out about those walking tours. So most importantly today, though, I want to know if there are any veterans in the audience. And given the way we set out the webinar, you're not able to raise your hand, but what I would like you to do, if you're willing, is to type your name in chat. And I've asked Chet at the end of the presentation before the Q&A if he would be willing to read the names of the veterans. And why am I doing that? Well, I really want to dedicate this talk to you who have served our country, because we're really talking about the first veterans of the First American War as we go through the tenant farmers in a very concentrated stretch here between the northern part of Dobbs Ferry and the southern part of Tarrytown. So we want to thank you for your service and honor you. So please don't be shy and type your names in chat. Okay, so I think that has, let me just see here, given time for my warm-up act to appear. Yes, here he is, Washington Irving. And I wanted to start with this quote from Irving because I think he really captured what is very unique about Philipsburg Manor, this colonial into the Revolutionary War era that we're focused on here. And Irving in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow does a great job of evoking the really unique situation of the Philipsburg Manor tenants, who were extremely closely knit in the years approaching the war. So I'll read here. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find the same trees and the same families vegetating in its sheltered bosom. And Irving was certainly right, because there was this Brigadoon-esque quality to Philipsburg Manor that was very unlike the other several great manors that were making up the lower part of colonial New York. After 5 generations of intermarriage in Philipsburg Manor, an Acker was a Van Tassel, a Storm was a Martling. And so it's worth it to spend a moment to say what made this place so unique, because it also made the pain of the division that arose during the Revolutionary War significant in the manor. So just to define the area that we're talking about, the map on the right shows you the actual land of Philipsburg Manor, one of several manors in lower New York that King William III in the late 17th century allowed a small group of connected, wealthy men whose loyalty to the crown was unquestioned. He allowed them to accumulate great tracts of land and great wealth. And one of these was Frederick Phillips I. He was to become Lord of the Manor, but his partner and first wife, Margaret Hardenbrook, was key to the development of the manor as well. The Phillips family had land in Albany, Barbados, Bergen County, New York City, vast tracts in the highlands of the Hudson Valley, but in many ways, the family's crown jewel really was this manor that spanned 52,000 acres from today's Spoit and Dival to the outer limit of New York, at the outer limit of New York City, to the Croton River in the north, and from the Hudson, which was then called the North River, to the Bronx. I want to acknowledge that this manor is the ancestral homeland of the Wecquaesgeek people, Algonquian-speaking people who were Munsee, or people of the Rocky Place, and related to the Wappingers just to the north and the Lenni Lenape just to the south. Frederick Phillips I and Margaret were the wealthiest couple in the colony in the late 17th century, and they used some of that wealth to buy up this land, both from the Dutch patroon Adrian van der Donck and the Wecquaesgeek themselves as well. You can see here on the left, one of the reasons why this manor was so unique, in that it was largely, in essence, fully intact at the time of the Revolutionary War, something that no other manor really could claim. So one of the reasons was that the Phillips family practiced the old British tradition of primogeniture. There was a brief period of time of division between the brothers Philip and Adolphus, when Adolphus managed the manor on behalf of Philip's minor son, Frederick II. But largely speaking, this land was kept intact and went to the firstborn son. If you contrast that, say, Van Cortlandt Manor to the north, where each of the children, male and female, received their own tracts of land, wonderful for them, but the manor itself was pretty quickly broken apart because of that. And there was another aspect of the Phillips business model that really accounted for the fact that the manor was intact at the time of the Revolutionary War. And that is that unlike other manors where land was sold off to allow the owners of the manors to live in their wealthy 1% lifestyle, the Phillips family had multiple income streams. Notably, greatest among them, per Frederick Phillips I, was the trade of enslaved human beings. Frederick, Margaret, and their children profited significantly from the kidnapping of men, women, and children from Angola and bringing them back here to be sold in the colony along with several other businesses. So instead of actually selling off the land in their manor, the Phillips practice was the business model of tenant farming. Now, each manor had tenant farmers, but this was the exclusive model that the Phillips family used. So you end up with 3 to 5 generations of tenants living on the manor next to the 4 generations of the Phillips family that you saw in the prior slide. And generally speaking, these tenants of Philipsburg Manor got along quite well with the various lords of their manor, who often extended low or no interest loans to build improvements on the leased farms, improvements such as a house or a barn or the planting of an orchard. When the leasehold, when someone died, the leasehold was allowed to be inherited by the children. And if there was no one to inherit in a given line and the leasehold was going to go to a different renter, the Phillips allowed the tenant farmers who had created those improvements or paid for them from a prior owner, prior leaser, to actually sell them. They took a lord's cut out of the profit there. But generally speaking, these terms were very positive for the tenant farmers, and there were no tenant revolts on Philipsburg Manor, unlike many of the other manors, including Frederick Phillips III's siblings, where there were revolts in their manors in the Hudson Highlands. And also what this meant is that many of the tenant farmers listened to Frederick Phillips III, the last lord of the manor at the time of the Revolutionary War, for guidance. Manor tenant farmers basically kept their heads down and their plows out. They were busy spending their time growing more prosperous, given their proximity to New York City, both through highways like the Albany Post Road and the water access along the Hudson. They largely avoided the growing political turmoil of the 1760s and 1770s. That is until March of 1775, when a call went out throughout all of Westchester that began to draw a line in the sand. Several powerful Westchester residents called for a meeting in the White Plains on April 11th, 1775, to take the sentiment of Westchester freeholders on whether to send representatives to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Frederick Phillips III and those opposed to having Westchester send support to the Continental Congress gathered at a tavern in what was downtown White Plains, very, very small village at the time. It was Captain Abraham Hatfield's Tavern. Undoubtedly, Fred, as he went by, paid for drinks for the 250 to 300 men who pounded the Hatfield Tavern tables in support of loyalty to King George III. About an equal number of men who wanted to explore how to begin to push back on the British Parliament gathered across the street at another tavern, the Tavern of Isaac Oakley. The Oakley crowd proceeded down to the courthouse just down the road from these two taverns and began to vote for representatives to send to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. When the Hatfield crowd noticed the Oakley crowd moving down, they followed. They were very, very angry, but they actually refused to vote no. They thought a no vote would actually sanction what they said was an illegal vote at the time. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of rabble-rousing, and a lot of loud singing of God Save the King. And at the end of the day, both groups retreated back to their taverns, and those, along with Frederick Phillips at the Hatfield Tavern, created a petition indicating the loyalty that they would have to the king. Frederick Phillips' name, you can see here on the petition, was the very first name signed. Many of his tenant farmers, including some who would later become the most prominent patriots, rebels, but they signed the petition at the time because they were not convinced that breaking from Great Britain was the right answer there. Interestingly, none of the tenant farmers were freeholders. So unlike people who actually owned their land in Westchester, none of them could actually vote. And Fred Phillips knew that very well, but he also knew the power of marketing and persuasion. And so we do have this one document that is not definitive in terms of who would be a loyalist and patriot, but is very interesting to take a look at for the sentiment at that point in time in 1775. Frederick Phillips doubled down on his loyalty to the king. On November 28, 1776, he signed the Loyalist Declaration of Dependence, and he continued to pressure his tenant farmers to support the crown. Eventually, he was arrested, paroled, and then violated his parole by informing the British of an American action. The New York Act of Attainder was passed on October 22nd, 1779, and that not only seized his property of Philipsburg Manor, along with a select number of other wealthy loyalists, but also ordered that Frederick, his sisters, their husbands, and their sons would be put to death without access to clergy if they were caught. So this was very serious stuff. And not surprisingly, Frederick and his family fled from Phillips Manor Hall in today's Yonkers to the safety of British-controlled New York City. They were never going to return to the manor here. And that set up a process that would be managed during the war by the New York State Commissioners of Sequestration, and then at the end of the war by the Commissioners of Forfeiture to first rent and then sell the farms on the manor of those whose property had been seized, including all of Philipsburg Manor, to raise money to retire the state's war debts. First dibs went to the tenants who had farmed the land in Philipsburg Manor, as long as they could prove that they were not loyalists. Now, I know you've heard of the famous, quote, neutral ground of Westchester County. And Westchester County was really unique in this aspect at the time of the Revolutionary War. Most areas of the 13 colonies were dominated at a given time by either American or British control. After the Battle of White Plains, the American Army established some permanent and semi-permanent outposts north of the Croton River. I highlighted that area in blue here on the map. It was an area that would be predominantly under the control of the Continental, AKA American Army. Loyalists in that area who did not want to keep their heads down or go underground, politically speaking, were either forced out or fled to other areas. British-occupied New York City was an obvious choice, but the area in pink at the bottom of the map, which is southern Westchester County, today part of the Bronx, was also another place that they went. An area was developed that was kind of a tent/hut village called Morrisania, or a refugee community for loyalists from other parts of the county. The reverse was true as well. Loyalist attacks on many patriot families, especially in mid to southern Westchester, forced many patriots to leave to move in with family and friends, generally in northern Westchester County. And the homes of the dwindling few who were trying to stay neutral, such as Quakers and others who were purporting to be neutral, they were not safe either. This slide helps a little bit also with some terminology. You can see some of the political cultural terms for the Americans, the Whigs, rebels, and patriots on the left, and Tories, British, and loyalists on the right. But you also get a sense here that there were several levels of combatants that were at play in this supposedly neutral ground. An attack could come from regular military, militia, and even two gangs, the Skinners and the Cowboys, that were loosely associated with both sides. So any given family was under assault from many levels and many fronts. On top of that, add in countless spies and double agents, and you begin to get a picture of how the war uniquely ravaged Westchester County. The neutral ground over time became an area of fierce resistance by both sides. British General Sir William Howe famously said of the residents of Philipsburg Manor, "I can do nothing with this Dutch population. I can neither buy them with money nor conquer them with force." It's interesting to spend a little bit of time on the militia that were active in the county at the time. Before the war, Neighbors and families had served side by side in local militia for decades. In fact, Captain Abraham Hatfield was a militia captain who both sides would have served under prior to the beginning of the political divisions in the county. But war began to force people to have to choose sides. Patriots joined the American militia. Loyalists, including many who had lost their homes in northern Westchester, joined what was called the Refugee Militia under former Westchester County High Sheriff James Delancey. Delancey's refugee militia were particularly well organized and often ruthlessly effective. While there were defined periods of time when American, French, British, and Hessian regular troops were active in our county, for much of the war, it was left to the local American militia and Delancey's refugee militia to battle it out. There were regular raids on military outposts, on houses of militia leaders, and frankly, anyone. A land that had been so fertile was increasingly desolate. Crops turned to weeds, cattle were stolen, remaining families took to sleeping in fields or in barns because they were afraid if their house was still standing that it would be burnt down while they slept. Westchester County and the neutral ground became a land of starvation, deprivation, and desperation. So I want to move and get very, very local now and talk about a few of the local families in the stretch from northern Dobbs Ferry to southern Tarrytown and how this terrible war affected them. This here, while you see the name of Daniel Wilsey, I want to focus on the names here. This is the Farms of the Storms. This was actually the farm here of Abraham Storm, and here the farm of John Storm. You can see a little bit of the outline that you may recognize there of Dobbs Ferry, and Mercy University today is right here at the northern part of Abraham's farm to orient you. So this is a story, the story of the storms is a story of prison and poison. And when I first started the research on them a few years ago, I saw that neither Abraham nor John had bought their farm after the war. And remember, to buy your farm, you had to prove that you were not a loyalist. Both appear to have signed that Hatfield Tavern protest declaration, which, remember, is not definitive. But my first wonder was whether these two particular storms might have been loyalists, but nothing is farther from the truth. Dirk Storm was one of the earliest members of the congregation of the Old Dutch Church of Sleepy Hollow. And his descendants, Abraham, aged about 50 at the time the war broke out, and his brother John, 2 years younger, enlisted in the 1st Regiment of Westchester County Militia under the very affected and respected Colonel James Hammond. Very effective and respected Colonel James Hammond. Both Abraham and John were seized at their homes early in their war for their support of the rebellion. Just this morning, I learned something about Abraham, Major Abraham Storm, and that is that the post office that existed in New York City had to be moved, and it was moved to the border of Abraham's farm and northern Dobbs Ferry there in September of 1776. And also the post riders kept horses at Odell's Tavern. So that might be another reason why Abraham in particular was targeted and arrested so early in the war. And you'll hear a little bit more about how Jonathan Odell was also arrested. So what happened to Abraham and John Storms? Statements by John Odell and the Storm family lore indicate that both Abraham and John were taken to the notoriously dangerous Sugar House prison in New York City. Family lore says that Abraham was never heard from again, which would make him one of the original missing in action veterans for an American war. We don't have time to talk today in detail about the British prisons in New York City and the surrounding prison ships, but thousands of Americans suffered and died of starvation, disease, random hangings, and yes, even poisoning. The British Provost Marshal William Cunningham appears to have destroyed most records of people who were incarcerated during the war, presumably because he did not want to be held accountable for their treatment. So it is very likely that Abraham could have died in prison. His brother John's fate was equally horrific. After suffering at the prison, John was either exchanged or paroled and died on his way home from prison back to his farm here in Philipsburg Manor. Family lore says that John's death was from poisoning that had been administered in the prison. And we do know that there was a French doctor at the time who was actively poisoning the prisoners. Jacob, son of John, bought John's farm. Daniel Wilsey, whose patriot credentials are unquestioned, bought Abraham's farm. And I found this image of a window that has been preserved from the Sugar House prison with a plaque that you can see in New York City and Duane and Rose Street to get a little bit more history from what happened there. So now I want to head north and talk to you about acres of Eckers and a Van Tassel to boot. I'm sure that these names are familiar to you. The Eckers, also spelled with an E as Ecker, and Jacob Van Tassel. Some of you have probably visited this place, Washington Irving's Sunnyside, and it is the site of the original Wolfert Acker farmhouse. Wolfert and Jan were two of the original settler colonists in this area. They moved here from Long Island. Marriage records suggest they married in 1682 and 1683 respectively. And Wolfert married Marriott Sybouts. I know that there are people on this call who are related to the Eckers and the Sybouts name is meaningful to you. It would have been Marriott's father's name. And they settled a farm that straddles the border of today's Irvington and Tarrytown. So when was the farm built? Well, you could be forgiven for guessing that it was 1656, but Washington Irving, who is you have to love him, but he is a notoriously unreliable narrator, himself alluded to the fact that he just liked putting that date on the house. It's more likely that the original house on this site, built by Wolfert Acker, was built in the 1690s. Wolfert's two sons, Stephen and Abraham, or their sons, but I believe it was his direct sons, added houses to the Acker farm. Abraham, or possibly his son Abraham II, built his house on the west side of the Albany Post Road, heading into today's Irvington. You can see it here on the 1779 map drawn by George Washington's engineer and cartographer, Robert Erskine. Wolfert's grandson, Abraham II, Abraham Jr., married Katrina Van Tassel, but not that Katrina Van Tassel, at least if you're thinking of the second most visited stone in the Old Dutch Church burying ground. That Katrina Van Tassel in the burying ground is Katrina Acker Van Tassel. This is Katrina Van Tassel Acker. So you can see the Dutch never let a good name go to waste. Abraham III married his next door neighbor, Jemima, daughter of Captain William Dutcher. The Dutcher farm is where Irvington is largely located today. After the war, Abraham and Jemima's home became the famous Acker Inn, a landmark on Broadway that hosted Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, presumably not at the same time, and many others until it was demolished around 1899. And you can see it here on this 1868 map. So now you know that Abraham Acker II married Katrina Van Tassel. Katrina's brother was Jacob Van Tassel. And it is likely that relationship led Jacob Van Tassel to lease Wolfert's farm. Probably what happened is that Wolfert and Marriott passed on. We know Stephen and Abraham already had their own farms, and so it was likely that the relationship with Jacob Van Tassel meant that he was the most likely person to lease the farm. Jacob Van Tassel was a focus of Irving's popular story, Wolfert's Roost. Irving enjoyed taking one part history and one part embellishment to gild the lily of the property he was going to eventually buy himself. What we do know about Jacob from primary sources is really impressive from a military sense. Jacob enlisted first in his neighbor to the north, Glode Requa's militia company, and then in James Hammond's regiment. He was promoted to captain. He was captured by the British when serving near the Croton River after completing an intelligence operation down the river, and he was taken first to a prison in New York City and then paroled, likely because of his officer rank, to Long Island. In November of 1781, he was released and he went right back into the service and eventually became promoted to be a major. Captain Buchanan was the commander of the local American whaleboats, referred to as the Water Guard. And Buchanan and the Water Guard used what was then a small harbor at the bottom of the hill on which Jacob's house stood to launch attacks on the British. It's said that Jacob himself would stand on the hill and use his goose gun to take pot shots at the British as they passed by on the river. In retaliation, while Jacob was imprisoned in New York City, the British landed a force that proceeded to burn down his house. I can tell you a funny story about that his daughter supposedly told if we have time in the Q&A, but it certainly was not funny that Jacob and his family lost the home in the war. I'm going to come back to the last acre at the end, but I wanted to talk next about a farm to the south and at least be able to touch on the farm of William Dutcher. The Dutchers were early settler colonists, and their property is where most of downtown Irvington is today. This map depicts the early 1700s, possibly 1732, because I have a tax map that coincides pretty closely with it from that year. By the time of the Revolutionary War, William Dutcher owned the Dutcher farm along with his wife, Catherine Conklin. On July 12th, 1776, the residents of Philipsburg Manor were alarmed when British vessels appeared right outside their farm in the North River. The HMS Phoenix, 44 guns, under Captain Hyde Parker, and the HMS Rose, 20 guns, under Captain James Wallace, had been ordered by Commanding General Sir William Howe to force a passage up the North River. They were not sure what they would encounter as they passed the American fortifications around Fort Washington, but when they moved safely through, Wallace ordered a bowl of punch and a bottle of claret to celebrate, and they came to anchor between Nyack and Tarrytown. The British thought was that they would receive an outpouring of loyalists who would come to the ships. That happened a little bit, but it was certainly no outpouring. And they were also interested in getting behind the American position. Washington feared that the ships would unload ground forces, but that did not happen. What did happen is that on July 14th, militia captain William Dutcher offered his services to raise a company of men, which became the Upper Philipsburg Associated Company of Militia. Dutcher himself delivered a message to Washington from Colonel James Hammond on July 15th to give firsthand intelligence of the Phoenix and the Rose and to summarize the local militia response. Dutcher and his company were part of the Battle of White Plains and also served, quote, on the water, probably associated at least with Buchanan's Water Guard that was launching from his neighbor, Jacob Van Tassel's harbor. Dutcher was rumored to be part of the intelligence/secret service. This is an area of particular interest and research for me right now, and I've not found primary source documentation to confirm that he was part of that. But I did find that as a militia captain in 1775, he was ordered by the Committee of Conspiracy to disarm local Tories, anyone who would not sign the oath of association. This was a time of neighbor informing on neighbor, and it was very serious to have your weapons taken from you. I'm sure it created deep hatred and resentment against him and his men by many of the loyalists and their families in the county. And I wonder if his role in this activity is part of that Secret Service rumor. So stay tuned. Like many patriots in the area, the Dutchers had to move for part of the war to the northern part of the county, staying with relatives in Salem in the winter of 1777 and 1778. A story that has come down through the family is that they left their farm in charge of people they enslaved. Think about how you would have felt being left behind at that moment. As the story goes, the British and/or Delancey's refugees came to the farm looking for the Dutchers and kidnapped the enslaved people, taking them out on a boat onto the North River, and threatened to push them overboard if they did not reveal information about the Dutchers. They were pushed overboard, but the tide was out and they were able to walk home. They must have been half furious and half shaking their heads at the British incompetence. I looked at William's will, and there was no mention of enslaved people, but I know that he was willed enslaved people from his father. So I do not have their names yet, but I'm working on finding the names of these individuals. And I'm conscious that the focus of this talk lends itself to the stories of male soldiers, but women and children, free and enslaved, were certainly caught in the middle of this terrible war as well. Another topic for another day is the service of Black and Indigenous soldiers, including the Rhode Island Regiment that fought with great courage and loss in the Pines Bridge attack in Yorktown on May 14, 1781. That's Yorktown, Westchester County. And Wappinger Sachem Daniel Nimham and his men who died in August 1778 fighting Simcoe and the British. Women also fought in the war. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man, enlisted under the name Robert Shirtliff, and fought in the 4th Massachusetts Regiment and was injured near Tarrytown. And women were spies. But most commonly, women either worked the farm or provided services as cooks, seamstresses, and nurses moving with the army. Catherine Dutcher told a story from the war that was recorded by her grandson that I'll share to give you a sense of the hardships on women and children at the time. One cold winter night, when William Dutcher was stationed away, she and her children heard a knock at the door. To her great joy, it was William, who had slipped away for a brief visit. The family was having dinner when one of the children, looking out the window, announced that she saw men approaching. William left by the back door and quietly moved to where he had hidden his horse. The men pounded and pounded at the door, and Catherine finally let them in. They demanded to know where her husband was, and she denied that he had been there, and they threatened to tie her to a tree and leave her to freeze to death unless she told them. One of the guards then yelled that he saw him, and they all took off. Catherine related that she heard the men fire, and she saw William stop, silhouetted on his horse up the hill in the moonlight. She thought he had been shot, but he had actually paused to draw 2 pistols and, firing with both hands, drove back his pursuers. He took off, with them following, and after an exhausting chase, he made it back to camp lightly near the Croton River. And while that story ends well for the Dutchers, it does strike me that word of his safety would not have reached Catherine for days at best. I wish I had more time to talk about the Dutchers and the Buckouts and the Jewels, but I do want to read you in on some new research and some new findings about 2 standing colonial tenant farmhouses in this area. First, the Odell Tavern. This tavern seems so familiar given how many pictures and stories I've seen, and likely you, but it's standing on private land, so I've never actually seen it other than its roof line when I sneak a peek from the road. I thank the Irvington Historical Society for this excellent picture. Sometime around 1693, it's reported that Jan Harms and Altja Abrams, his wife, built their home here. It would have been 1-room square with a wide open fireplace for cooking and heating, a ladder to the sleeping loft, a stone foundation with an outside entrance to a stone-lined cellar, and a wide double Dutch door. Sometime between 1742 and 1746, the tenant farm was leased by Matthias and Sophia Conklin. I have not seen it, but documentation indicates that a stone on the side of the tavern has carved into it C for Conklin, M for Matthias, and S for Sophia, and the date May 8, 1746. We believe that Matthias and Sophia enlarged the home around that time with a 2nd room and improvements to the 2nd floor. During the Revolutionary War, Jonathan Odell, and his wife, Margaret Dykeman, owned the improvements and leased the land running Odell's Tavern. Famously, the tavern was the site of the New York State government for one day on August 31st, 1776, when the Committee of Safety was fleeing from New York City to their own safety in the Highlands. They received a letter while at the Odell Tavern from Washington, notifying them about the defeat at the Battle of Long Island/Brooklyn, a battle in which John and Abraham Odell, sons of Jonathan and Margaret, were fighting. Washington politely asked the Committee of Safety to have the local militia reinforce the Harlem River area. Equally politely, the Committee of Safety wrote a letter here declining, saying they knew the land very well, and it was more likely that an attack would come through Kingsbridge. And would His Excellency be so kind as to issue an order to drive all the horned cattle, hogs, horses, and sheep off New York Island and Lower Westchester into the interior of the county to save them from the British. It gives us a little insight into the confusion and potentially a little competition about who was on top early in the war. The Irvington Historical Society has these great photos of a reenactment of an event that occurred in November of 1776. The British left the Battle of White Plains and moved to the west, encamping, some of them, on Odell's Slope. They killed all the hogs, cut down the orchard, destroyed the wheat, and took prisoner Jonathan Odell, who was taken off to New York City. Fortunately, Jonathan survived. The family also tells the story of a man they enslaved named Caesar, who was taken prisoner at this time by the British and tortured because the British wanted him to reveal where more of the stores were hidden. They half-hung Caesar, the practice of the gangs and undisciplined militia on both sides, which involved putting him in a noose and hanging him until he passed out, but cutting him down before he died. They did this several times, but Caesar would not speak. They left him hanging the last time to die, and someone, stories vary here, either another enslaved person or some girls in the family or a neighbor's family, saved his life and cut him down. Here is where we may have some news in history that can update the story of the tavern. Secondary sources have reported that Jonathan Odell and his wife, Margaret Dykeman, moved to the tavern from Van Cortlandt Manor to the north in 1756, the year their son John was born. This date matters a lot because, number one, we want to get history right, but also, number two, it's important to have an accurate history of their son John Odell, who was one of the great guides of Westchester County, and a key focus of the soon-to-open Odell House Rochambeau Headquarters Museum. Now, I like to check anything I read in secondary sources before I put my name on an article or presentation. And little did I know that when I went to check on the 1756 date, that I was going to lose a couple weeks of my life hunting down primary sources that suggest a different story. A key challenge when working in history in colonial Philipsburg Manor is that we don't have any land deeds because of the tenant-farmer model. So we have some spotty tenant-farmer records from the Phillips family and other errant documents. So one of the first places I checked were the few rental lists that we do have for the Phillips family. This one from 1760 does not show any Jonathan Odell or any Odells, but he should have been there if the 1756 date is right. In addition, Jeffrey Amherst traveled this area in 1759, and his journal cites a Conklings. Remember, the Conklins had the tavern after the Harmses in this exact location. The town book of the manor that survives shows two lists of tavern owners for the years 1760 and 1761. Interestingly, there is a Deliverance Conklin listed, the same last name as owners Matthias and Sophia, but no Odells. Matthias did have a brother named Deliverance who lived down the road. In 1771, Nathaniel Ames's almanac cites Conklins in this exact location. And we have evidence of Van Cortlandt Manor records suggesting Jonathan may have still resided in Van Cortlandt Manor at least through 1768. And there's more. The bottom line is that it is likely that the Odells did not take over the tavern until sometime in the early to mid 1770s. Whoops, hold on. Let me just tell you one more thing. It's possible that Matthias's brother Deliverance ran the tavern while Matthias and Sophia left, and they did relocate to Orangetown, Japan. And one of the reasons why I'm so focused on this history as well is that in the stories of John Odell, one of Washington's great guides and a decorated hero who we know enlisted in Tarrytown in May of 1776, is that he received the gift, an extraordinary gift, from Pierre Van Cortlandt, from Van Cortlandt Manor to the north, on his enlistment of a gray horse, a beautiful gray horse. And I found out that Pierre Van Cortlandt bred gray horses, so this was a very personal gift from him, a pistol or a set of pistols, and possibly a sword. Many survivors of the war, as recorded in the McDonald papers, talk about John Odell's beautiful gray horse and noted that Delancey's refugees, even James Delancey himself, who was a friend of John Odell before the war, spent a lot of time trying to get that beautiful gray horse. I can tell you an incredible story of one of the many events involving John during the war in the Q&A if you'd like, or we can talk about another Odell relative who was a spy along with John André and involved in the capture of Benedict Arnold. But I want to sneak in one more farm before we go over to the Q&A. And I'm going to head back up north, and we're going to talk about the Stephen Acker farm. And this is a story that's very meaningful to me because I did the research that resulted in, with work by several residents and the Historical Society serving Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown, and the wisdom of the village of Tarrytown in landmarking this colonial tenant farmhouse. And I see it as a story of hope and reconciliation. So Stephen was the grandson of Wolfert. He married twice, first to neighbor Bridget Buckout and then to neighbor Charity Bont. He raised a large family in this house that it is likely his father, Stephen, Wolfert's son, built on the Wolfert Acker tenant farm. Stephen, the grandson, along with his son, John, and Abraham and John Storms, and Abraham Acker and Jacob Van Tassel, and so many other neighbors enlisted under Colonel James Hammond in Westchester County's 1st Militia. Stephen was called an older soldier at the time, which I get a kick out of because he was 53, younger than me, but yes, he was older than many soldiers, but it gives you a sense of his patriotism. And given the many raids in the area involving Hessian soldiers, it's possible he may have faced Hessians in action. So what do we know about Hessians? Well, if you know your history of Washington's Christmas crossing of the Delaware, you know that sometimes Hessians were a little too merry on Christmas. And if you're from my village of Sleepy Hollow, you know that Hessians regularly come out around Halloween. But the real story is that King George III was overextended with wars when the Howe brothers were unsuccessful in convincing Ben Franklin and the rest of us to not revolt. The king reached out to Catherine the Great of Russia to try to borrow some soldiers, but she flatly refused. So he made deals with a set of principalities in what is today's Germany to rent some soldiers. While some of these soldiers volunteered, the majority were conscripted because of the forced enlistment laws in these principalities. They were generally well-trained and came to serve as auxiliaries to the British. Most came from the Principality of Hesse or Hessen-Kassel, so the name that stuck was Hessian. So why am I going into all of this detail? Because, as the story goes, the Stephen Acker homestead would come into the hands of the son of a Hessian deserter. What I do know is that John G. Forkel did buy the house in 1826. He was born in Tarrytown to a George Forkel in 1788. And the first record I have of George is his marrying a local girl by the name of Jane Garrison and having daughter Elizabeth baptized in the Old Dutch Church in 1787. But was George a Hessian deserter, as the story goes? Research is continuing, but there is a tantalizing possibility in the record of Donop's Hessian troops who were very active at different times in this area. We have the Hessian record of a Caspar Vorkel. Caspar was recruited or conscripted as a Jaeger. The Jaegers were skilled foresters and riflemen who became very valued critical troops, sort of special ops during the war. Just before evacuation day in 1783, when the troops would have been sent back, a Caspar Vorkel deserted. Scores, if not hundreds of vessels left New York City on evacuation day, so it is possible that Caspar deserted in this area. A German name like Vorkel could easily sound as if it starts with an F, because names were very often phonetically recorded at that time. So it is possible that this is John's father, who fell in love and married a local girl, and that the house of Stephen Acker was purchased by the son of a Hessian deserter. What I do know is I had found a letter from Washington Irving to his nephew in 1842, talking about longing to return to his sweet little sunny side and to be able to sit on a stone fence and talk about politics and rural affairs with neighbor Forkel and Uncle Brom, who would have been Abraham Acker III. I bet a few of you have sat on one of those stone fences in this beautiful village on a summer day and talked to a friend about politics and local affairs. So some things never change. I wanted to end with this slide because it's the only photograph I can show you of the people that we're talking about today. This is John Forkel's daughter, Rachel. Rachel married David Mann, the Manns having bought the western portion of Stephen Acker's farm between the Albany Post Road and the river. John, her father, was Irving's shoemaker, and Rachel was his shirt maker, operating out of their home. And the Irvington Historical Society, which shared this wonderful picture with me, has a shirt that Rachel made for Irving in its collection, which I just think is incredible. So I want to end on that hopeful note that this community, so torn apart by a terrible civil war, was able to heal. A Hessian deserter's son may have been the friend of Washington Irving. We can thank these original veterans, the farmers of Philipsburg Manor, who put down their rifles and picked up their plowshares to transform this war-ravaged county to provide food and stability for our new American country. So I want to thank you for listening. I hope that you will take note of the website here for Revolutionary Westchester 250 and an email if you have questions. I've already enjoyed hearing from several of you who had questions about this topic. But do sign up for our monthly newsletter so we can keep you posted on all things happening Revolutionary War going forward. And so, Chet, now I'm wondering, did we have anyone put their name into the chat as a veteran that we can thank?
We did. We had several. We had Vic DeSanto, who was the U.S. Army. Donald Odell, which was U.S. Marines. Henry Weiss, who was a Vietnam War era veteran. And Diane D said that her husband, George, is a veteran. So that was the ones that kind of put their focus in.
We thank all of you. And Vic, I didn't know that about you, that you were a veteran. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Let me start off with a question. One thing I always find really interesting is, you talk about these tenant farmers and that they didn't own their land, and yet at the end of after the Revolutionary War, when the commissioners of forfeiture were starting to sell the property that had been Philipsburg Manor, some of these tenant farmers purchased large farms, and which would have been fairly expensive, I would think. How were they wealthy? Where did they get this funds in which to buy all these large farms of property?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. A couple of different places. We do know that some were lent money by relatives, and there are a few records like that. New York State actually set up a small mortgage program to help people borrow some money initially, because throughout the war and at the end of the war, specie, right, currency was very precious and dear. So it was very hard for people to buy that. Some, I suspect, did not have the means to purchase their farm. One of them is a gentleman by the name of Steinmetz, who eventually is going to buy back part of his farm, but it takes him a couple of years to do that. I'm not quite sure why that delay, but it might have been that he needed to get some money available to be able to buy it. But you're right that there were also speculators too. There were people who had money. And so some of these farms that weren't purchased were purchased by fairly wealthy speculators from New York City. And I say speculators because they generally turf the farms over after a couple of years. But I guess the last thing to say there is that some of the tenant farmers who purchased the farm also had to sell it after a couple of years. So it's possible that they overextended and had to sell some or part of their land in order to be able to pay that debt that they owed for purchasing.
Okay, so I'm going to refer to some of the questions in the chat. There's actually some great comments in there too. I just want to let people know about. Philip Hayes said that his wife's fifth great grandfather is Harmon Yorksey. His farm was 300 acres just south of Hawthorne Circle and ran down to Upper Cross Road, which is Stevens Avenue. And this farm was passed down to his son, a patriot, and later awarded to his wife, Susanna C. Yorksey, for their contribution to the war effort.
Well, that's a great story. And I suspect that the Yorks are the Yerkes as well. There's so many different variants on that name, Yerkes. John Yerkes was one of the extended captors of Major John André and is a very interesting person. But also that was a divided family. There were Yerkes who had to go to New Brunswick and leave because they were patriots during the war. So I'm pretty sure that it's all part of that larger group. And these names, again, being spelled phonetically, would get divided up down different variants over time.
Another comment having to do with the gangs you mentioned that were in the neutral ground, the Skinners and the Cowboys. And someone noted that the Skinner have been attributed and perpetuated by James Fenimore Cooper to support the Patriot cause. However, there's some primary source documentation by James Thatcher, which suggests that both the Cowboys and the Skinners allied themselves with the British. Do you have any knowledge about that? Or
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic, right? And Cooper, by the way, married the daughter of a loyalist. So he had a deep interest in Westchester County and in this particular area. You know, loosely speaking, the Skinners tended to be associated with Americans and the Cowboys with British. But there is a lot that's been written that says they actually cooperated together and would stage events where it appeared that they were returning cattle or other things that they had taken. So I think that the scholarship is really ongoing in terms of that. But there were definitely some people who might have been militia by day and gang by night as well, because this was a very fluid, dangerous place. And some of this was survival, right? People were literally starving. So if you thought that you could get beef on the hoof or something from somebody who was technically your opponent, you might have gone extra militarily and done something like that as well. So it's a little murky, but I would just summarize by saying most people would say that the Skinners loosely associated with the Americans and the Cowboys loosely associated with the British. And by the way, the captors of Major John André were accused of being both Skinners and Cowboys by various people, largely because of what Talmadge said about them in Congress in 1817.
so I just noticed in the chat, another veterans put their name in, Skip Dewitt, who was a U.S. Navy veteran, which is great to hear.
Thank you.
And then here's a question about, you talked about the Odell Tavern, which is here in Irvington, and the question arose, is the Odell Tavern the same as the Odell House where Rochambeau uses his headquarters? And they're not, but maybe if you could explain what the relationship was between the two
And it is confusing, right? Because we are, how lucky, right? That we have these two structures that are colonial era farmhouses and both have the name Odell in their name. So the Odell Tavern, as you heard me talking about today, was managed by Jonathan Odell and his wife, Margaret Dykeman, from just before the war through the war. Their son, John Odell, well, actually, they had Abraham Odell and other sons too. Abraham ran a blacksmith shop across the road from the tavern that was supposed to be involved in intelligence gathering. And one thing I read about Abraham is that he was considered, and the word used was a dude, because he really liked to dress nicely. So I kind of stick in my head that image of him. But they, the parents lived there at the Odell Tavern. At the end of the war, John Odell, like many of the veterans and the loyal tenant or the American tenant farmers, was able to purchase land. The land that John Odell purchased and the farmhouse that was on it had come through the Tompkins family, and right before the war was owned by the Bates family. And the Bates family is the subject of a lot of research by me and a couple of people who are likely on the call today as well, because Gilbert Bates had to flee. That property was attainted or seized by the New York State government during the war, and it was rented out to be farmed. I do have records that one year it was farmed by Nathan Fish, who was also an American soldier. But at the end of the war, John Odell, the great guide's son of Jonathan and Margaret, purchased that farm. And it is the story of John Odell, and during the war, before John owned it, Rochambeau having his headquarters at that farmhouse during the war, and the tenant farmers before it, that the museum is working to begin to tell, hopefully opening in 2026. It's very exciting to have a new museum open in this county through a lot of hard work by Susan Seal and her excellent board.
So another question, you talked about the farms, the Acker, Dutcher, Odell, other farms that make up kind of Irvington between Tarrytown and Dobbs Ferry. Those all were sold to the tenant farmers at the time. Were there no loyalists there, or why were there no loyalists, or were there not many loyalists in this part of Westchester at the time?
Yeah, and that's really interesting too, because the first walking tour that Robert and I did focused on Hastings-on-Hudson, the wonderful plaza there that is the Battle of Edgar Lane's Plaza, through Mercy University. And in that stretch, I had found out that there were loyalists who lost their farm. There was Peter Post, who tried to stay neutral, and interesting stories about Peter Post, of course. And then there were patriots who were able to buy their farm at the end of the war. So when I started to research this leg for the second walking tour in today's presentation, it was patriot, 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 patriot. So it just so happened, but it also tended, if you remember the map that I showed you, the closer you got to New York City, the more that you did tend to find loyalists there, but scattered throughout the country as well. But it just so happens, Irvington, that it was all patriots in their particular area.
So another question, are the tenant houses, and I think the hotels, tenant houses, whatever, are they still standing and open to the public? And maybe, you talked about the Acker Inn, which was torn down, the Odell Tavern, which is still here. So maybe you just describe which of them are still standing and which are potentially open to the public.
Yeah. And they're a combination, right? So when the Odell House Rochambeau Headquarters Museum opens, that will be a tenant farmhouse that is open to the general public.
That's in Hawthorne, correct? Is it
yeah.
in Hawthorne? Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Then there are a number of them that are in private hands, like the two in Irvington. They're privately owned, so they're not open to the general public. I spoke to the owner of another tenant farmhouse just last week, who is passionate about discovering the history of his farmhouse. That one is in Bronxville. Why am I blanking on the name of the one in Yonkers? Connie, if your mic was on, I know you're shouting it out right now, but there are a couple that we can still visit. The Sherwood House, thank you, Michelle. The Sherwood House in Yonkers, that is an incredible museum that you can still visit and go into. So they're in varying states. Also, there's, of course, Sunnyside, right? But Sunnyside was rebuilt because the house was burned down. It's not really going into a tenant farmer house. It's kind of Washington Irving's fever dream of what he wanted his home to be.
Is the Forkel house privately held, or is that
Yes.
open? That's
Yes, it's privately held.
Okay, okay. I think unless anybody has any more questions, I think we've kind of come to the end of our questions. And Char, you know, obviously the depth of knowledge that you have and you bring to this subject is amazing, and it's just great. I see Connie just noted that on Wednesday the 12th at a Irvington Board of Trustees work session, she'll be sharing a little bit about a background about the RW 250 and what it's going to bring for our community and whatever. So you might also want to check at that to get more information. But Veronica, maybe I could just ask you to come in and because I know you always like to give some final thoughts when we have such a really wonderful presentation like this. So please come on in.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Char, for terrific research and a terrific presentation. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, and our audience it was probably glued to the screen as you spoke.